And we'll get started. Father God, I just thank you that your word says that wherever two or more are gathered in your name, that you would be here. And I just trust, Father, that you're here tonight to guide us, to lead us, to teach us, Father. And I just pray that again that you lead us by your Holy Spirit, Father, to the things that you would have us to learn tonight. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, we're in chapter 19. We didn't quite finish chapter 19 in Genesis. We quit after Sodom and Gomorrah were totally destroyed, if you remember. We read down through verse 29. So we'll pick up there, finish that chapter and start in verse 30. Of course, you all remember what happened there, okay? Lot and his daughters escaped. They went to this little town called Zoar, and they went there because Lot was afraid to go up in the mountains, and he was a city boy by this time, and he wanted the benefits of being in the city, so he talked the angels to sparing that little town, although everything else was destroyed around there. And if you remember, his wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. Now, we didn't talk much about that, but that's all that said, is that she looked back and became a pillar of salt. And if you remember, that whole area there, that Dead Sea, is salt flats. Everything is salt. I mean, there's salt everywhere. There's salt pyramids and salt spires sticking up out of the water of the Dead Sea all over. So a lot of the writers think that, when it was raining brimstone and fire and everything down in that area, that vast clouds of salty substances would have been in the air. And if she looked back and stopped, I mean, that's how close they were. I mean, she could have been just totally covered with that, and became a pillar. It solidified, killed her right there, and she became a pillar of salt. Not necessarily that her body was turned into salt, but she became a pillar of salt. That's the theory, anyway. We really don't know what happened, except that she became a pillar of salt.
But isn't it in the New Testament where it was compared to, like, if you put your hand to the plow and turn back, that then they use Lot's wife as an example?
Not in that one. It didn't use Lot's wife as an example.
No, but I mean, isn't there?
But that's right, and that was Jesus talking.
That's what yeah.
And he was talking about people who were becoming followers of his, and who wanted to go back and do other things.
Right.
They wanted to bury their father, or they wanted to finish raising their family, or they wanted to, take care of their business first, or whatever. And Jesus told them that no man, no one puts his hand to the plow and then looks back. So if you look back, of course, the analogy was, if you're plowing a field, if you're looking at an object, to keep a straight line. And if you're plowing a field, if you look back, you're going to do this. You're going to veer off to the side, and you're going to be corrupted. And that's what Jesus was talking about. Mm-hmm. Okay. But at any rate, Lot's wife, was obviously loved her city, her home life, and all of that, and she was very distressed at the fact that she had to leave, left everything, and she didn't want to leave. She looked back. So, and that was the end of her. Okay, we're in verse 30. It says, "Then Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains. And his daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his two daughters dwelt in a cave." So the very place he was afraid to go, all of a sudden he decides that's better than this little town, for whatever reason. And we can only speculate that, that little town, they were just as corrupt as they were in Sodom and Gomorrah. And here is Lot with his two daughters, and, God had spared him. So here he was, this stranger. So he was probably in more trouble there in that little town.
Well, and he wasn't a man of what's the word, influence.
No, he didn't have any wealth anymore.
Right.
All his wealth was gone. It was just him and his daughters. So at any rate, he decides to head up into the mountains where the angels wanted him to go in the first place. And they dwelt in a cave. In verse 31, it says, "Now the firstborn of his daughters said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to come in to us, as is the custom of all the earth." In other words, there's no one we can have relations with. Okay. They were used to the lifestyle in Sodom and Gomorrah. These girls were products of that town, of that society, as you'll see here in a minute. She says in verse 32, "Come, let's make our father drink wine, and we'll lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father." In other words, their father didn't have a son; it was just the two daughters. So, verse 33, "So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. It happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, so that you may go in and lie with him, so that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Then they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father." Strange incident. The firstborn, verse 37, the firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And the younger, she bore a son and called his name Ben-Ammi. He is the father of the people of Ammon to this day. So I guess what they set out to do, they did accomplish. Lot's name did get carried on. In fact, if you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 2.
Was it Moses' wife a Moabite woman?
Moses was married to a Midianite.
Oh, Midian, okay.
If you remember, it's a little bit different.
Midian, okay.
Deuteronomy chapter 2, turn there, if you will. Let's see, of course, this is Moses. They're still in the desert here, Moses and the children of Israel. And so let me start reading in verse 9. It says, "Then the Lord said to me, Do not harass Moab." Of course, that was one of the sons, remember, of Lot. Nor contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. The Emim had dwelt there in times in the past, a people as great and numerous and as tall as the Anakim. They were also regarded as giants, that is the Rephaim. Now these were the big guys, okay? Like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them Emim. The Horites formerly dwelt in Seir, but the descendants of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and dwelt in their place, just as Israel did in the land of their possession, which the Lord gave them. Now if you go down to, let's see, 16, so it was when all the men of war had finally perished from among the people that the Lord spoke to me, saying, that is Moses, This day you are to cross over to Ar, the boundary of Moab, and when you come near the people of Ammon, do not harass, that is the Ammonites, that's the other son of Lot. It says, do not harass them or meddle with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the descendants of Lot as a possession. So you see, God kind of took care of those two guys and gave them property. And when Moses was coming through, of course, they were wiping out a lot of the locals. I mean, there was 2 million Israelites came out of Egypt. And as they were moving around into the promised land, they were wiping out a lot of like Og, the king of Bashan, and several others. They're wiping them right out. But these two, they were descendants of Lot. So, and God preserved them. God protected them. So Moses left them alone. Okay, let's go to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is kind of I was thinking of even maybe just skipping it, because it's kind of a rehash of something that happened to Abraham in Egypt. But maybe somebody could just read it, read the chapter. Somebody want to read other than me?
We can take turns.
Just read the whole chapter, chapter 20.
Okay. Now Abraham journeyed from there toward the land of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. Then he sojourned to Gerar. Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman who you have taken, for she is married." Now Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, "Lord, will you slay a nation even though blameless? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'?" And she herself said, "He is my brother." In the integrity of my heart and in the innocence of my hands I have done this. Then God said to him in a dream, "Yes, I know that in the integrity of your heart you have done this, and I also kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all of yours." Judy?
Keep going.
What, somebody?
Okay,
Which
8.
verse 8.
one? Okay, I'll go. Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should not be done." And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reason for doing this?" Abraham replied, I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, "This is how you can show your love for me. Everywhere we go, say of me, 'This is my brother.'" Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, "My land is before you. Live wherever you like." To Sarah he said, "I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are here with you. You are completely vindicated." Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, his slave girls, so that they could have children again. But the Lord had closed up every womb, in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife Sarah.
Okay, thanks. So you see, yeah, here's Abraham was at it again, you know,
He did the same
making
thing.
sure, telling Sarah to tell them, you know, the people that lived there, this Abimelech and his kingdom, that Sarah was his wife, was his sister, and because he was afraid of his life, and that was an agreement they had made, you know, way back, that whenever we're traveling, you know, say that you're my sister, because then they won't kill me. And that was because Sarah was so beautiful. Sarah was a gorgeous lady. And it was the custom of these kings in any one of these towns, when they saw, you know, a woman of her stature, they immediately wanted her for their harems. That was the thing that was very, very common. And so here's Abraham, and actually this Abimelech is a pretty good guy. Okay, he was actually a God-fearing man. Okay. So anyway, okay, that's chapter 20. Now let's go to chapter 21. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. Remember, he said, this time next spring, I'm coming, and you're going to have a son. For Sarah conceived, verse 2, and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Notice it says at the set time. God's got a set time, you know, for everything. And Abraham, verse 3, and Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. The word Isaac means laughter. Okay. Remember when Sarah laughed?
He was laughing.
Okay. Well, Abraham had a little laugh about it too. But anyway, that was his name, laughter. Verse 4, then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God has commanded him. So you see Abraham here being obedient to the covenant he had made with God. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all will hear who will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. Remember, she was beyond the age of childbearing. So this was a miraculous birth. So the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw that the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. So Hagar is well, my translation uses the word scoffing in verse 9. It's making sport of him, making fun of him is really what he was saying. Now at that time, remember, Ishmael would have been about 15 years old, and Isaac was just weaned, so he might have been 2 years old, or not much older than that. So Sarah saw Ishmael making fun of Isaac. Verse 10, therefore she said to Abraham, cast this bondwoman and her son. Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be the heir with my son, namely Isaac, with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. I mean, after all, Ishmael was his son too, right? But God said to Abraham, don't let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. Remember, he had promised this before. So Abraham rose early in the morning, in verse 14, and took bread and a skin of water, and he put it on her shoulder, and he gave it and the boy to Hagar, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered around the wilderness in Beersheba. That's down just past Hebron. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. And then she went and sat down across from him, a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So it was, the food had run out, and now the water was run out. She's out in the desert, and they're nearing death. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God, the messenger of God. Now, who's the messenger of God? Jesus. Okay. Then the messenger of God called Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. Now, whether that well just appeared miraculously or whether it was there all the time and she just hadn't seen it in her state, we really don't know. At any rate, all of a sudden, there was all the water she needed. Verse 20, so God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and he became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Remember, she was an Egyptian, so that's evidently where they wandered and probably went into Egypt and came back. Okay, verse 22. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech, now that's the same Abimelech that had taken Sarah into his harem here in chapter 20. That Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of the army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. And Abraham said, I will swear. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this, for you did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asked Abraham, "What's the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you have set by themselves?" And he said, "You will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well." Therefore he called that place Beersheba. That's literally the well of the oath, because the two of them swore an oath there. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree, or plowed a field there, in various translations, in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. That's the first time we see the word Philistines used in the Bible. That word Philistines, by the way, that's where Palestinians comes from. It comes from that word of Philistine. Okay. So here you have Abraham making a treaty with the locals. Remember, he was a wanderer. He lived in tents. Abimelech had a city, a walled city. He was king of a city. And, you know, the cities, they dwelt in the cities, and they had, surrounding the cities, they'd have their farmland and pasture land to support the crops and the animals to feed the city. But outside of that was where Abraham was. He was out in the country by himself. And Abraham was probably wealthier than Abimelech, and had some, you know, pretty sophisticated army. I mean, Abimelech was probably worried. You know, if Abraham wanted to, he probably could have wiped Abimelech right out. But anyway, at any rate, the two of them made a treaty, and to live in peace. That's what that chapter basically was about. The only arguments they had was over water. Okay, and Abraham was always proud of the fact that he dug his own wells. He never went to any other wells. He always had his men dig their own. Okay, now we're coming on chapter 22. Now, chapter 22 is probably one of the most important chapters in the entire Bible. Okay. And it's really important that you understand everything that happened in here. It happens in here. This is all about Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. And the parallels with Jesus are very, very obvious. But you've got to remember now, as we get into this chapter, that Abraham and God are now blood brothers as of a covenant. Okay? I mean, God himself is spirit. He didn't shed blood yet. Okay? Not yet he hadn't shed blood. Later on, when his son becomes a man in Jesus, he will shed his blood. But at this point, he simply accepted the burnt offerings, the blood that of animals. He accepted that substitute. Remember, he went through the pieces, okay, and accepted that offering. And on Abraham's part, the covenant was circumcision. Abraham shed blood, and all of his descendants, he was to circumcise them, just like he just did to his son Isaac at 8 days old. So there was a blood covenant between the two. And blood covenants are covenants that are, well, it's the strongest covenant between men. Blood covenants exist all over the planet. When people, explorers have come upon primitive societies, one of the things they do is for treaties between tribes and whatever is cut blood covenants. Blood covenants are just a basic form of the most solid treaty, if you will, that mankind makes with one another. Even organizations like the Mafia, I mean, they always made blood covenants. They actually mingled blood. And when you're a blood brother, I mean, you do whatever your blood brother tells you to do. I mean, if it's killing your wife, you do it. I mean, there's no questions asked. You do whatever your blood brother tells you to do. It's that strong of a covenant. Okay, there's nothing you wouldn't do for a blood brother. And that was the relationship now between Abraham and God. So you got, from that understanding. And by the way, we in Christ are now blood brothers with Jesus. So think about that for a minute. But because we're in Christ, we're blood brothers with him. Okay, let's start on this in chapter 21. And think about these parallels. Think about the parallel of Jesus being sacrificed on the cross and Isaac being sacrificed as we go through this. I'm sorry, somebody.
Chapter 22, Jim.
Chapter 22.
Yeah.
Okay. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. Now the word tested there, that's not tempted. Okay, God doesn't tempt anyone. Tested him means he's testing him. He's finding out, he's checking his loyalty as a blood brother. Okay, that's exactly what he's doing here. And he said to him, Abraham. And Abraham said, here I am. Then he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Wow. Now that's an awful shock. It had to be a shock to Abraham. But keep in mind, sacrificing children was common in the land in those days, amongst all the pagan tribes. Those Canaanites, worshiping their false gods, sacrificing a child was the highest form of sacrifice, was the highest form of worship of their gods. Okay, so it was not uncommon. I mean, that just sacrificing your son would not, but it was uncommon with God, because God, the real God, doesn't ask you to do that kind of thing. But here he's asking Abraham to take your son, your only son. Now you notice he says your only son. Well, of course we know that he's got another son, Ishmael, right? But according to God, Isaac is his only son, because that's the son, that's the line that God is preparing. That's the descent, if you will, that's going to lead up to the Messiah. That's going to lead up to Jesus. And several times here he calls Isaac Abraham's only son, at least 3 times. And not only it's your only son, it's the one you love. Okay, it's the one that Abraham loves. And of course Abraham obviously loved Ishmael, but his love for Isaac had to be really strong, really great. And here he's saying, I want you to go and offering him as a burnt offering. And it's interesting what he said here. He said to go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. So it was this very specific spot where God wanted Abraham to take Isaac and sacrifice him. And it was called Moriah. And that area is described in the Bible really only one other time. And that's in turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 3. And this is all about Solomon building the temple. Okay, remember David was going to wanted to build a temple, but because he had so much blood on his hands, God said, no, Solomon, your son's going to build the temple. And let me see here. Okay, let me read verse 1. Everybody there? 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. Now Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So this is the place, Mount Moriah, where Solomon was building the temple. Now that's the spot, the exact spot, that God wanted Abraham to take Isaac up to that spot, that piece of real estate. That piece of real estate, you know, that is the most contested piece of land on the earth. Okay, but God has chosen that spot.
That's the Dome of the Rock.
That's where it's in that general area. Okay, it's in that it could very well be in the Dome of the Rock, just underneath In fact, when we were in the Dome of the Rock, we had a look at it. There's a rock there. That actually, you go inside, that's what there is a rock. And supposedly that was the threshing floor of Onan, the Jebusite. And so that could be the very spot, could be right in, if that's the correct spot, that could be the actual spot where Abraham took Isaac. Let me see. Let's see, I was gonna. Okay. Well, that's all right. If you remember, this was the spot that David had bought. Without going back and reading it, let me just summarize it for you. David, against God's wishes, took us a census of the fighting men of Jerusalem, of Israel, so he could see how powerful his army was. And God had told him not to do that because God was in charge. You know, God would always provide for David. No matter what, David could have gone out with 3 men and conquered whatever. Okay, but at any rate, David defied God and did this census. Well, God was mad at, God was angry with David, and he actually sent a plague on the people. And in order for that plague to stop, David had to, according to one of the prophets that came to him, had to offer up a burnt sacrifice. So where does David go? He goes to this Jebusite guy who's got this threshing floor right up on top of Mount Moriah, and he says, I need to buy your land from you so that I can set up an altar here. And Onan, the owner of it, said, no, I'll give it to you. You can have it. You know, and in fact, he said, here's some animals that are up here that you could use for sacrifice. You know, and here's lumber, here's firewood you can use. And David said, no, I'm buying it from you. I would never, he said, offer anything to the Lord that I didn't buy myself or didn't own. So he purchased it for a fixed amount. David bought that piece of property, and he owned that. And of course he did set up an altar there and offered a burnt offering, which is, Isaac was to be a burnt offering. At any rate, that it was that exact same spot. Okay, so David bought that and paid money for it. So if there's ever any argument about that whole area there around where the Temple Mount is, David bought and paid for that. Okay, that belongs to the nation of Israel for certain. So it was Mount Moriah. So that place was exactly, and of course, that's the same area, same general area where Jesus was crucified as well. He was crucified just outside the city limits, which would have put him right on Calvary, which is that mount, which I don't, whether it's the exact same spot, I don't know, but it's close enough. So that's exactly the place where the real sacrifice, Jesus was sacrificed. Okay. Okay, let's go back to Genesis 22. We're still in verse 2. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. Now, a burnt offering in the scriptures, remember the first burnt offering was Noah. Remember, Noah had all these clean animals on the ark, and when he finally came out, he built an altar, and he killed a variety of the clean animals and offered a burnt offering. That was the very first burnt offering. And it was pleasing to God. It was a pleasing aroma to God. And the burnt offering is always of the type where, when you look later on in the law of Moses, the burnt offering was always something that was burned up completely. Most of the other offerings, like fellowship offerings and sin offerings and a lot of these others, were part of the priests would eat part of it. It was food for the priests. Okay, but not the burnt offering. The only thing they could keep from a burnt offering was the hide of the animal. The rest of it was to be burned up completely. Entrails, you know, the meat, head, everything was to be burned up. The only thing they did was they quartered it. They had to quarter the animal, and then it was burned on the altar. That was a burnt offering. Okay, except for birds. Except for birds, they didn't quarter birds. They burnt them whole.
What was the significance of quartering them?
I don't know, but they were told to quarter the animal. That's a good question. I really don't know. Probably just for ease of handling.
Yeah, you couldn't pick them up otherwise.
Yeah, it's just probably. I'm just guessing.
Practical, right?
So, actually, when you think about it, it's kind of gory. But if Abraham was going to do what he would have had to quarter his son. So, at any rate, so this was a burnt offering. He was to offer Isaac up, and he would have been burned up completely on the altar if of course he had gone through with it. Okay, verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. So Abraham doesn't hesitate. He didn't say, "No, God, I don't want to do this." First thing he got up early in the morning, he split the wood. Okay, he's going to bring the wood along with him. And he took 2 of his men with him.
Did he tell Sarah?
Pardon?
Yeah, I doubt that.
Maybe your son.
And he went out to the place which God had told him. Now, of course, he's heading north. He's heading north from Hebron. He's going. It's only 40 miles north up to where Jerusalem is today. So he was going on about a 40-mile journey. And then on the third day, on the third day he gets there. Okay, the third day, yeah.
Significance there.
Another significant thing. Abraham lifted his eyes and he saw the place afar off. Okay, so he was probably, my guess, he would have been on the Mount of Olives, roughly, and you look off and you could have seen the Jerusalem and that area. Of course, Jerusalem wasn't the city there. Jerusalem wasn't there. It was just the hills at that time, during Abraham's time. Just the bare hills. So he saw the hill where God wanted him to go. In verse 5, and then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Okay, so he didn't want the 2 guys to go with him, 2 servants. This was just him and Isaac, and he said, "We'll go." He didn't say, "We'll go yonder, and I'm going to sacrifice my son." He says, I will go yonder and worship, and we'll come back to you. Now, offering a burnt offering is a form of worship. So he wasn't necessarily lying. But that word worship typically just means to fall down on your face in front of God, to bow deeply in front of your God. Okay. Verse 6, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. Now isn't that significant? He took the wood and he laid it on his son. Remember, Jesus carried the cross. Jesus carried at least probably the cross beam, okay, up to Calvary where he was crucified. So here you have Isaac carrying the wood. And he took the fire in his hand. Now that would have been a kettle, with the coal, with the embers. That's how they carried fire around. They carried the burning coals with them. And the 2 of them went together. Verse 7, but Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" So Isaac, of course, he doesn't know what's going on here yet. But he knows about burnt offerings. We don't really know how old Isaac was here, but he was probably at least a teenager. Okay, he was obviously strong enough to carry the wood. He was no toddler, and he was old enough to know all about burnt offerings. Some Bible commentators will say that he was probably in his early 20s, but I really don't think it was quite that old. He was probably a teenager, okay? But anyway, of course, then they went together. Verse 7, or verse 8. But Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together. Now God had told Abraham to bring his son there and sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering. But here Abraham says, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So he's telling, this is really a prophecy. Abraham is really prophesying here. And he's saying that, look, God's going to provide the offering. Now, that might have been a little reassuring to Isaac, because Isaac had to be wondering here what was going on.
In verse 5, he also said, "We will worship and return to you." So he knew he was coming back with Isaac.
And we will come back to you.
We will return.
We will come back. That's a good point.
That is
I think it's the most important point in the whole thing.
Yeah, that's very, very.
Because he said,
I'm glad you brought that up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Did you notice what she said in verse 5? He says that the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Okay.
He knew he wasn't going.
And Abraham wasn't known to be a liar.
No.
Okay. Okay.
Well, he stretched the truth.
And
No, he knew God. Even if God would raise him up.
No.
here's what Abraham was thinking. Turn to Hebrews chapter 11.
You don't tell mother everything you
Yeah.
We can remember that.
And this will shed some insight into exactly what Abraham was thinking.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Hebrews chapter 11.
Oh, yeah.
The faith check.
Everyone there? All right. This is the faith chapter. Verse 17. It says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, who had received the promises, offered up his only begotten son." Now even Paul is saying here that Isaac is his only begotten son. "Of whom it is said, in Isaac your seed shall be called." Concluding, now there's verse 19, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead,
Amen.
from which he also received from him in a figurative sense. Abraham concluded that if he was to go through with this, that God would raise his son from the dead.
Amen.
And why? Because God had promised that through Isaac, his descendants would number like the sand on the seashore, like the stars in the sky. Isaac couldn't die, not permanently. It couldn't happen. Otherwise, God would be a liar. So Abraham knew in his heart that he was just to continue doing what God told him to do, and that God was going to be faithful. His blood brother was going to be faithful, no matter what. But he concluded that, look, if I have to kill Isaac, God's going to raise him from the dead, because his descendants are going to number like the sand on the seashore. See that?
Nobody been raised from the dead.
Okay, well, let's go back. Verse 9. Back in chapter 22 in Genesis. "Then they came to the place of which God had told him." So now this is a specific place. I mean, he could have had Abraham build an altar anywhere, and do the same thing, but it was this specific spot. "And Abraham built an altar there, and he placed wood in order." Now, altars typically were built out of stone, and it was always built out of stone that was not dressed, stones that were in their natural state. So basically, what he did is pile up stones and make an altar. "And he placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood." Now he bound Isaac, and we don't see any indication that Isaac struggled here at all, or that Isaac, questioned what his dad was doing. If he did, it's not recorded. Okay. And he laid him on the wood. And in verse 10, "And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son." But the angel of the Lord, now who's the angel of the Lord? The messenger of the Lord is Jesus, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Okay, so God stopped it right there. Don't lay a hand on him. This was simply a test to see if Abraham, was going to be faithful and do that ultimate test, sacrifice his son whom he loved.
Would the boy have heard God saying that? Or
Pardon?
would the boy have heard God saying that, or does that only go?
We don't
to
know.
God?
We don't know. But surely Abraham did.
Yeah.
And beyond that would be only speculation. Possible? Very possible. Okay, verse 13. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went out and he took the ram and offered it up as for a burnt offering instead of his son. So God provided a substitute. And you know what? God provided a substitute for us too. Because remember, the law of sin and death, the penalty for sin is death. We're the ones that were destined for death. But God provided a substitute, his own son. Okay. And in verse 14, and Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. That's Jehovah Jireh. That's the Lord our provider. As it is said to this day, in the mountain of the Lord, in the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. Now there's another name there, in the mountain of the Lord. The mountain of the Lord is always Zion. All the way through Scripture, the mountain of the Lord is Zion. There's another confirmation that this spot, is Zion. No doubt about it. Okay. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, now look at what's said here, because this is really, really significant. And he said, this is God talking, he said, by myself I have sworn. By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, and you have not withheld your son, your only son. Now he's going to give the three-part three-part covenant, which he had already in several places talked about and told Abraham about, but now he's going to confirm it and solidify it by swearing by himself. Okay? And when God swears by himself, I mean, there's no more powerful thing in the universe than that. And it's because Abraham did this, because Abraham was faithful to do this, God swore by himself and gave him this covenant. He says, blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. So Abraham is going to have many, many, many descendants. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. Now that's the land. He's talking about the land. That's the land promise. Okay, remember he told Abraham that he would, all this land that you see between them, that your eye can see, when he was, and actually it was between the Nile and the Euphrates. That's the land promise. And then in verse 18 he says, in your seed, in your descendants, all the nations, that is the Gentiles, all of the ethnicities, the ethnos in Greek, of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Now we know how that happens. All the nations are blessed because of Jesus, because God would now send his son to be the real sacrifice. So all the nations of the earth will be blessed, and that includes us. Okay, so that's those statements by God. That covenant is what we call an unconditional covenant. I mean, there's no conditions to this. I mean, there's nothing else Abraham has to do, okay? Abraham was simply obedient. But there's no conditions to fulfilling this covenant. God's going to do it. That's an ironclad guarantee about the descendants and about the land and about all the nations being blessed. That's an absolute guarantee from the creator of the universe. Okay? And so Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt in Beersheba. I wanna just summarize some of the things that were parallel here in comparisons with Jesus, and we indicated a few of them. But let me just go through about 10, 12 of them here. Some commentators come up with about 20, but they're kind of marginal. Number one, both of these sacrifices were driven by their fathers. Okay, Isaac was taken by his father Abraham. Jesus was offered up by his father God. Remember, Jesus didn't want to go through that sacrifice, but he said, "Nevertheless, your will, not mine." The second one, his only son. Obviously, Jesus was God's only son, and Isaac was God's only son. Because he was the child of promise. Okay, he was the one that was born by a miracle. That's another one. This was an absolute miracle. Jesus was born by a miracle. Sarah was too old for childbearing, but God did a miracle and she got pregnant anyway. Mary did not know a man, but she became pregnant anyway through a miracle. The fourth one, it's the son whom you love. Obviously, God loved his son, and as well as Abraham loving Isaac. It was at the same place, Moriah, Zion. They were both sacrificed at the same place. Isaac, as far as we know, died, and then he died, and his other brother married, and so on. And whose wife will she be in the resurrection? In verse 29, Jesus answered and said to them, "You're mistaken, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels of God in heaven." The angels of God in heaven don't marry. They didn't take wives. Okay? It says they took wives from men. Angels don't marry.
There you go.
I mean, so there's a direct,
So there is a
very direct
clear-
statement saying that those are not angels, those sons of God,
Right.
in Genesis 6. They don't marry.
That's what makes heaven heaven.
What's that?
You don't, that's what
I
makes
heard that, Jack.
That's what makes heaven heaven.
They don't
Scriptures I've heard.
they don't procreate. Okay? They don't procreate, and as far as we know, they don't have the ability to procreate.
Right.
Especially with a human, let alone with themselves. So there you have direct evidence about what Genesis 6 is saying.
So if not being married is heaven, being married must be.
Let's go.
Right.
Okay, let's go back to Genesis 6.
Did I say that too loud?
You said it very well. You did it very well. Very well there, kid.
It happened, it can't hear.
I can hear perfectly well.
Yeah, Mel can hear anything.
No whispering in there.
Let's look at this word. Let's look at this word for a little bit in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. And it says, "There were giants on the earth in those days, and afterwards the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the men who were of old, men of renown." First of all, notice that there were giants on the earth in those days. That was the days when these sons of God went into the daughters of men. Okay, the giants were there already. Okay, there were giants in the earth in those days. And also afterward, when the sons of God, and after the sons of God, after the angels, after the so-called angels, but it's really the sons of men, sons of the righteous ones, came into the daughters of men, the unrighteous women. the giants were also there after that as well. It doesn't mean after the flood. Okay, a lot of people read that and say, well, gee, the Nephilim were before the flood and after the flood. There must have been angels. That's a total misreading of that word. That's not what that says at all.
Jim, what is a giant?
The giants, the word is Nephilim.
Yeah.
Now the word Nephilim means a feller.
A what?
F-E-L-L-E-R, someone who knocks trees down. A woodcutter would be a feller. Or someone who pushes over columns. Someone who knocks down monuments is a feller. Okay?
Like,
And the secondary definition of it is tyrants or bullies or despots. Someone who...
Somebody who's 10 feet tall.
It's not talking about any, not even describing size. It's not talking about size at all. It's talking about their stature in society.
Yeah, when they use the word giant, that's not a good translation.
Nope, not here. But they all use it, you know, okay? It really should say feller, but because a lot of people don't understand what feller would mean, they put in that word giants. Well, they probably should put the word tyrants or bullies. Would be a lot better. And they were the source of a lot of the violence, the huge amounts of violence that was going on in the earth in those days.
But Jim, did they come from the line of, they were always there, or did they come from one of, like Cain or something?
They came from the line of Cain, and now, because the righteous line, those sons of God came into Cain's line and started having relations with these, not of the righteous line, okay? They're outside of their godly line, which they shouldn't have done. When they did that, then these giants also, these children of those weddings, that they married all who they chose. The result of that was these tyrants and bullies and men who proceeded to do a lot of violence. A good example of a tyrant, someone like that would be Saddam Hussein. He was a bully and a tyrant, someone who dominated, someone who did what he wanted. If somebody was in his way, he killed him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Okay, that's what it's describing. I mean, the world is full of those now, but it was really full of them back then. Okay, but that's what that word means. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't men later on that were of giant stature.
right.
Okay, because there were some big guys.
Yeah. What's
You know, like the king of
Goliath.
Og, the
Goliath.
king of Bashan. He was like he
Also,
was like over 9 feet tall, and Goliath was probably close to 10 feet tall.
Yeah.
You know, all the sons of the Anakites. It scared the death out of. Remember Caleb and other spies that went into the.
went into the
And they saw that he said the Anakites were there, and wow, we were like grasshoppers in their sight. I mean, these guys are big. We can't battle them, you know. So yeah, there were giants, but that's not what this is talking about at all. Okay, this is totally different. This is a totally different word.
It was just because, yeah.
Good luck.
Let's see. I'll have to show you something else too. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But,
Nephilim means
Um,
feller.
yeah, go to Genesis chapter 10. And this is a little while later on. This was the sons of Ham. Okay, and it says Ham begot Cush in verse 6, and down in verse 8, Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one, a hunter on the earth. Now that word right there in the Septuagint Bible, in the Greek Bible, which was the Bible that was there when Jesus, during Jesus' ministry, that's the word gigas. G-I-G-A-S. Gigas. He was a mighty one. And if you go back in that same translation, the Septuagint, go back to Genesis 6 where it says the Nephilim, that's the word that it uses in the Greek, gigas, the mighty one. So here we have Nimrod being described essentially the same as the Nephilim.
Oh.
No. Nimrod was not a product of angel-human copulation, okay? He was fully human. Okay. His dad was Cush. Cush begat Nimrod. Okay. Cush was not an angel. Just more evidence, okay, that it's not talking about angels here when it's talking about giants. All right. Let's see. There's other things that they'll use to, for example, they'll go back and use the book of Josephus, which is a history book, a Jewish history book that was written by a Jewish historian, Josephus, during the time of Christ, or just after the time of Christ. And he makes a few statements in there that are always taken out of context. If you go back and read Josephus, he does not saying that the Nephilim were angels. He says that they were of the line of Seth. He's very clearly. And I won't take the time to go and do that, but if you read in Josephus, they'll always quote Josephus and say, look, here, you know. But when you go back and read it, that's not what Josephus was saying at all. So that's not an argument either. I'm trying to cover all the bases here, okay?
So you're saying they're not of the line of Seth? Nephilim?
They are of the line of
They
Seth.
are.
They're not angels.
Yeah.
These are not
Yeah,
angels
yeah,
that
right.
procreated with the daughters of men. Okay? In fact, he very clearly says it's the sons of the righteous line that began to take wives from actually the line of Cain. And that was the problem. That became to be the problem. Now, they also use some other scriptures. Now, go to 1 Peter. Sorry if this is taking some time, but we got to deal with this because this is so much in the news, and so I want to cover all of the scriptures that they use.
And don't you think we're hearing more of it now?
More of it
Because
in the end
time
times.
is
And that's the warning
of
that in these
God's
last
return.
days, yeah. All this deceiving stuff.
Oh, yeah. And Mormons too.
1 Peter chapter 3.
Three?
Yep. And I'm just going to read 3 different verses here. I won't comment too much on them. 1 Peter 3, starting in verse 18. It said, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. There is also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of filth of the flesh, but an answer of a good conscience toward God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him." Okay, notice that Jesus went and preached to these spirits in verse 19, who were formerly disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. Okay, now let's go to 2 Peter chapter 2. In verse 4. For it said, For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. And then go to Jude, the last book before Revelation. Let me read verses 2 through 6. It says, "Mercy and peace and love be multiplied to you, beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once delivered to all the saints. For certain men," notice that certain men have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were marked out for this condemnation, ungodly men, who turn the grace of our God into lewdness and deny the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. But I want to remind you, though, that once you knew this, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels, verse 6, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. As Sodom and Gomorrah, verse 7, and the cities around them in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Okay, now, here again, they'll read these verses, including the ones in Peter, and they'll come to these verses here where it says that similar to, it's about Sodom and Gomorrah in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh. They'll associate that with the angels and the Nephilim. And there's just nothing there. Okay, the reason for the judgment of the angels was in verse 6. The angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode. That's why they were judged. They followed Satan. They followed Satan and left their domain, their assigned domain, and followed Satan. And notice it says in verse 7, it says, as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in a similar manner to these. Now the to these refers back to verse 4, the certain men. That's all what he's talking about here is these certain men in verse 4. In verse 8, he says, likewise, these dreamers defile the flesh. In verse 10, he says, but these, that's these same certain men who speak evil, whatever they don't know. They're like brute beasts. Verse 12, these men are spots on your love feasts, that, you know, during your communion services while they feast with you. That's what it's talking about. Back in verse 7, these refers to those. It's not referring to angels, okay, it's just ridiculous. But yet, that is exactly what they'll do. They'll take these verses and say that refers to these angels. I mean, isn't that crazy? Now, we know there was angels in Sodom and Gomorrah that came down to warn Lot, right? Remember? And Lot had him in his house. And it was the men of the city that wanted to go in and have sex with the angels. Okay, these gay men. That's why Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. Okay, as far as they were concerned, I don't even know if they knew they were angels. They just knew that they were some good-looking guys. That's all. Okay. But it has nothing to do with the Nephilim. Absolutely nothing. But they'll bring these verses up all the time. What God has done here is these spirits, I mean, he's got them in chains, in darkness, reserved for the day of judgment. And when it says in chains, it doesn't mean he has them locked up so they can't do anything. Okay, they still have a certain amount of freedom. They're just being restrained. And if you find out they're being restrained, if you go, remember we looked at that a lot of times in 2 Thessalonians, the restrainer, he's going to restrain them, okay, until they're set free, until the restrainer is taken out of the way, until Michael, our warring angel, who's keeping these angels under wraps, which he started when? He started them when Noah was building the ark, because he wanted to give Noah enough time to build the ark. That's what it says. He went and preached to those spirits who were in prison since that time. Since that time, they've been under chains. They've been restrained ever since then. So that Noah was given time so that he could build the ark, to hold off all of this violence that was going on. I mean, he would have never had it done otherwise. But at any rate, that's what these verses are talking about. Okay, he's restraining until he's taken out of the way, and that's going to happen the middle of Daniel's 70th week, not too distant future. Okay. Let's see. What else do I need? Okay, as long as we're in Jude, you're still there? Okay, Jude, look at down at verse 14 and 15.
What was it? Jude 14?
Verse 14 and 15.
Okay.
This is another verse that they use very, very clearly to support the book of Enoch. Verse 14. Now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men. It's still talking about those men, okay, these men that are blemishes. Prophesied about these men, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of their ungodly deeds which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. So what Jude is saying here is Enoch, the seventh from Adam. Now that's our Enoch that we just read about, okay, of that righteous line. It says he prophesied. Now they'll say, oh, well that comes from the book of Enoch. Well, wait a minute. It doesn't say that at all. It says that Enoch prophesied that. The book of Enoch was written by somebody else who probably had this verse, that he does have this verse in chapter 1 of the book of Enoch. But all the Jews knew about this verse because it was handed down more than likely through oral tradition, all the way from the days of Enoch, all the way from right through Noah. This was a prophecy given actually by Enoch. But notice Jude doesn't say it is written in the book of Enoch. Just because Enoch prophesied this, and this is also included in the book of Enoch, doesn't mean that the whole book of Enoch is right. Okay? Or that this quote in Jude comes from the book of Enoch. Jude is quoting this from tradition, not from the book of Enoch. There's nothing in here that would justify the book of Enoch as being a legitimate source of truth. Nothing, absolutely nothing. See that? Okay. By the way, the Septuagint, when I look through the Septuagint, that is the Greek Bible, it never ever mentions angels as the sons of God. Ever, not once. Okay? It's always angels of God. The sons of God, it's a modern translation in Genesis 6 that comes from the Masoretic text, which is the modern Hebrew text. It doesn't even come from the old Hebrew text. It comes from the modern Hebrew text. And that is a text of choice for a lot of Bible producers, Bible printers, okay, Bible translators. They'll use the Masoretic text, which is a modern Hebrew text. It doesn't come from the older text, and it doesn't come from the Septuagint. Okay. Let's go back to Genesis 6 again. And let's just read verse 1 and 2 again. It says, Now when it came to pass that men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. Now when it just says men solely, it's not talking about the line of Seth, about the righteous line. It's talking about that other line. It's implied in here. It doesn't say that directly, but you've got to read that into the text. As they began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. By the way, took wives here is the same word that's used all through the scriptures to justify a normal covenantal marriage. Okay, it's not anything unusual. It's not involving anything unnatural.
Or running in and taking
Not
them
at
out of the
all.
tent.
It's just the same. It's a regular marriage, covenantal marriage. They took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Now that means they probably could take more than one. Yeah, not just one, but more than one. Okay, and the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with them forever, with man forever, because he indeed is flesh. Now notice, because of this, God says, I'm not going to strive with man, not angels. I'm not going to strive with man, for he is flesh. He's flesh. Angels aren't flesh, angels are spirit. And his days shall be 120 years. Another more evidence that the clear language here is God is talking about men. Okay. And this caused God great consternation, that his righteous line was now beginning to cohabit with, the unrighteous line. Because now they were going to be corrupted. And they were. And so God didn't have much time. If he had waited a few more generations, let's say after Noah, there probably wouldn't have been any righteous men on the earth at all to preserve anymore. So he had to act quick, and Noah was a righteous man. We'll get into that, and he protected him in a lot of ways. And we'll talk about that more. But God says here that his days will be 120 years. Now we've talked a lot about that. You remember Moses was writing. God said his days will be 120 years. Well, obviously, if you look at that chart, they lived a lot longer than 120 years. Okay. And it's talking about the days of mankind. It's talking about mankind's days will be no more than 120, will be 120 years. Now, some say, well, that was the distance between when he said that and the flood. Well, that's not true at all. And when you look at when this statement was given, it was less than 100 years. Okay. So the only conclusion that you can come to really is that the 120 is the longest distance that God prescribed to Moses, which is the Jubilee season, the 50 years. And if you take the 50 years multiplied by 120, you get 6,000 years. Okay. And we're heading up to the end of the 6,000th year. All right. If you look at the chart, Abraham was 2,000, but Jesus comes in at 4,000, and he returns at 6,000. 2,000, 4,000, 6,000. Very nice. Works out absolutely beautiful with, using the Jubilee years. And it turns out that the year that Jubilee year is when you set the captives free, and when the Jews came out of Egypt. Guess what year that was? That was the Jubilee of Jubilees. They were set free. It was the 50th Jubilee. It was 2,500 years. Exactly, right to the day. So, I mean, there's just so much circumstantial evidence that what he's talking about here is 120 Jubilee years. That's the days of man. That'll be the end of the day. He's not going to put up with man forever. He's not going to strive with man forever. Okay. And of course, if he would have wiped man out completely, he would have wiped out Noah too, but he didn't. Right? He's preserving man. He didn't wipe out man in 120 years. He preserved man, but he's going to judge the ungodly.
Say that again, Jim. You're saying that when it says his days will be 120 years.
The years is a Jubilee year is the way I'm interpreting it.
For all mankind.
I mean, I can't say that with 100% surety, but that's the only thing that even fits mathematically. And when you begin to put that in, it just fits like a glove. I mean, it's just, there's so many things fall into line when you use that it's almost impossible that it's not that. Okay. Bible chronology.
If you go back to the oldest translations you can find,